In Arunachal Pradesh, as you know, the history is in 1914 there is the Shimla Pact, and the Chinese nationalist government representative Chen Yifan came to Delhi and then to Shimla, and he initialed the document while the Tibetan representative Lonchan Shatra and the British Indian representative, the Secretary of State Henry McMahon, they had an agreement on this. The difference between them was about the inner Tibet, outer Tibet creation, and on which Chen Yifan walked away from the Shimla conference, but not on the McMahon line per se. And so this is considered to be the border between India and China in the Arunachal Pradesh area. In fact, Chou En-lai in 1958 and Deng Xiaoping in 1980, Chou En-lai also repeats the same in 1960 of a swap proposal. That is, if the Indian side recognizes Aksai Chin as part of China, then they would recognize south of McMahon line, which we now call as Arunachal Pradesh, will be recognized as part of India. Of course, Nehru government did not recognize this because even the Chinese don't have any claim to the Aksai Chin area as such, because 1893 maps of China do not mention about Aksai Chin, and their entry into Aksai Chin is because the British India wanted to bring in the Chinese to occupy areas closer to the Haji Langar and other areas, because they thought that the Tsarist Russians were penetrating into this region. So it was the British Indian side which had invited the Chinese to settle down so as to counter the Tsarist Russians. So the Chinese hardly had any control over the Aksai Chin, and their maps do not mention Aksai Chin as part of China, or Xinjiang province as they used to call. So in the light of all this, the Indian side rejected the swap proposal in 1960, and while it was reminded by Deng Xiaoping in 1980, we did not accept the whole proposal as such. What we have accepted is a fair, reasonable, and mutually acceptable solution to the border, while the Chinese men kept on mentioning about mutual accommodation, mutual understanding, MUMA principle. That is, the Chinese have a more sinister design here, rather than simply if you show so and so land is yours, you have the land rights, you have the sovereign claims, etc. The mutual accommodation is, as they have mentioned, the NIFA, Arunachal Pradesh, as a swap to the Aksai Chin, is a mutual accommodation. Right. You accommodate me in this sector, I accommodate you in the other sector.
So if I could just stop you there, if you don't mind. I mean, the swap we talk about, we know about this, but we also know how passionate the Chinese are about Tawang, for why they want Tawang. We also know that when we talk about the Dalai Lamas, when we talk about their Panchen Lama, we know the politics and the kind of thinking that the Chinese have. So, number one, do we even believe in the swap theory, the swap proposal that the Chinese have put forward? And if not, because if we put Tawang in the whole scheme of things here, then we're looking at a different picture altogether. Is it not?
Yes, indeed. Coincidentally, the Chinese never claimed Tawang prior to the 1980s. It was in 1980s they began looking at this issue more closely, and three reasons why they raised Tawang. One is, of course, the 15th century Dalai Lama came from the Tawang monastery and had the Lhasa Tibet connection during that time in terms of the religious rituals, tax collection and other things, which generally are part of the sovereign related markers. So their argument is that Dalai Lama came from Tawang. So the Dalai Lama belongs to Tibet, Tibet belongs to China, so Tawang should belong to China. So it's a kind of specious argument. So what, in other words, the Chinese are saying is, if the next Dalai Lama is from Shillong, Shillong belongs to China. So that's a very dubious kind of argument they are making. So the religious argument is one argument the Chinese put forward in terms of the Tawang Tract. The second is because the Dalai Lama, the then Dalai Lama, came from one of these three tracts in Tawang: Monyul, Lower Sayul, and Soyul. So there is the long linkage. But when we look at the PLA entered into Tibet only in 1950-51, and they imposed the 19-point proposal on the Dalai Lama, who rejected this in 1959 and fled to India. So the religious argument is not very concrete, and in fact the former Chinese Foreign Minister Li Chaoxiang, he wrote a book on this Dalai Lama who hailed from the Tawang tract, by saying that this Dalai Lama was a debauch. He was drinking, he was having all the worldly pleasures, and so that's the kind of discourse they have pushed in the domestic audience in China by Li Chaoxing and others.
Sorry, sir. That's insofar as their own constituency is concerned in terms of the PLA, the government. So it's an inner politics, the domestic politics that they have to cater to. But when we look at the larger picture, the bigger picture, the LSE, then we've talked about, and we all know it's all perceptions. But when we come to the eastern flank, as you call it in your article, which you've written for the Borderlands, it's actually beautifully mentioned in terms of where are we, and also insofar as the perception is concerned. So the LSE, if the Chief Minister of Arunachal Pradesh wants to open up border posts, and when the LSE is not recognized by the Chinese, then how are we to actually move forward with the Chinese government insofar as coming to a situation where at least the LOC, the LOC is recognized by China, like it is maybe in the western sector, but in the eastern sector in Arunachal Pradesh, the perception about the LSE actually goes into various dimensions, and therefore I think it makes it that much more complex, doesn't it?
Indeed, and within the Arunachal Pradesh sector of the border, you rightly mentioned about Tawang as the apple of contention between the two, and in the special representative meetings between India and China, Tawang has been raised as an area of contention by the Chinese side, especially the Chinese special representative Dai Pingkou had also mentioned in public discourse that they need some concession in Tawang. And for India, this is simply impossible, because there are elected representatives from Tawang for the local assembly, and also two members of parliament who come from that area. And so there is simply not possible for any concession in that area. So we should assume then that there is no territorial dispute possible if Tawang is the apple of contention between the two sides.